This is The Room to Write in the Journey of a Story series, and my name is Colleen Getty, and I'm here with writer Rajani LaRocca, and we're going to talk to her about how she writes and what she writes. Welcome, Rajani.
Thank you very much, Colleen. Nice to be here.
And we usually start out by sort of just getting a picture of, if you want to sort of paint a picture for us, what does you writing look like, sound like, et cetera, et cetera.
So me writing, I almost always write on my laptop, but sometimes I write on my phone. I can be in any room in my house. I've been known to write in my car, in parking lots, waiting to pick up children, in waiting rooms, waiting for them to finish their music lesson or whatever it is they're doing. So pretty much anywhere at any time I could be writing. That's generally me.
Okay, and I guess we should tell everybody you're also a doctor in addition to being a mom and in addition to being a writer. So I don't know if you want to talk about the realities of trying to do 3 different things and how you fit that in, and what the process is if you have a piece of writing, how long that takes when that's not the only thing you get to do all day.
Yeah, so yes, I'm a primary care doctor at MGH Charlestown, which is part of Mass General, but it's in a part of Boston called Charlestown, and it's a wonderful community health center. So, in fact, I would say that it's actually great that I don't that I have many things to do, because it makes me probably more productive at each one. So when I'm at work, I'm really at work. I pay attention to my patients. I, get my messages, interact with my nurses and stuff like that. And then when I'm done with work, I really do try to finish work at work and leave it there. And then I come home. I usually have a couple of hours before my children come home and the whole dinner process happens. So that's when I try and squeeze in some writing. And then my children are older, so one is in college and one is in high school. So after dinner, pretty much, one of them doesn't live with us anymore, and then the other one has lots of homework, so she goes off and does that. And my husband owns his own business, so he's pretty much working 24/7. So then I have time after dinner too.
Okay.
And and those days are good. And sometimes breaking things up into, I only have a half an hour, I've got to accomplish something, is better than just having hours.
Right.
Yeah.
And so you have Midsummer Mayhem, which is coming out soon in June.
Yes,
is it?
June 4th.
And that's a middle grade novel. Do you want to talk a little bit about, where do all of a sudden you're a doctor, you're a mom, and now you're a writer? So how does that sort of happen? Has that been your whole life? Is that sort of a new revelation, the writing part, or how'd that sort of come about?
So I always loved books. Like, I read early, and I just loved books, all kinds of books, regular novels, comic books, cereal boxes, like just, random magazines from when I was a kid. And so I read all kinds of things as a child, and I loved them. And I'm an only child, so I really felt like a lot of those characters in books were my siblings and my best friends,
Right.
in a way. And then when we would go, my family is from India, and when we would go to India over the summer, it would be wonderful. Sometimes we'd go for like 2.5 months. But my cousins, who were all around my age and wonderful, but they had school. So
Right.
I was kind of like, well, what am I supposed to do when they're in school all day? So I would go down to the local library there and read all kinds of stuff, some of which was inappropriate for a kid my age, but it didn't really matter to me because I was like, okay, keep reading. And then there are these books called Amar Chitrakatha. They actually look like comic books or graphic novels that show all these tales of Indian mythology and history. So I read all of those, and they were like a couple of hundred, I would say, and I was obsessed with them. So those kinds of stories actually kind of filtered into my subconscious, I'm pretty sure. So then, back up a little bit, I was here in the US going to school, and I knew from a very young age that I wanted to be a doctor. So everything kind of led in that direction. But I loved English, and I loved writing in English class. And I remember in high school, I had a creative writing teacher who said to me, he said, I know you want to be a doctor, and that's great, and you should. He's like, but there are lots of doctors who write. So check out these books. It was Richard Seltzer and, William Carlos Williams and Oliver Wendell Holmes. And And I did. And I was like, okay. So then in the back of my head, I think I kind of knew that this was a possibility, and he had planted a seed that would only come, to fruition much later. Then in college, I did a lot of essay writing, but then medical school, like there was no extra writing. I couldn't even imagine
There's no
it.
sleep besides writing.
Yeah, it was a lot of new stuff going into my brain, and then residency even more so, just kind of working many, many hours, and then young motherhood, which as is overwhelming and exhausting, and you don't you're always on call. You're like, oh yeah, you're awake again. Here I am. So it wasn't until my kids were in grade school and middle school that I came back to, okay, what am I going to do creatively for me? Right. And I was a big theater person in high school, but I was like, I don't think I have the time or the energy to go audition for things. So I said, why don't I just take some writing classes? And so I started with some online classes through writers.com, and they were wonderful. And then I kind of focused in on, I think I want to write for kids, because those were the most memorable books for me, were the ones that I read as a kid. Right. So then I found some local classes at Grub Street, and that just set it all off, because not only were the classes really interesting and kind of showed me the possibilities of what you could do with writing, but I met people, and then we formed a critique group, and then I had people who were waiting for me to tell them the next part of the story. Okay. And so that was really the spark.
And so, I mean, I think that is sort of amazing in this day and age where you're supposed to be doing everything online and, not in person. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the importance of actually connecting with other people and sort of almost work in that the creativity, like you talked about, you're a doctor and a mom, and then there's sort of this, and I don't know if it's every single person in the world, but I know for me, and it sounds like for you and a lot of creative people, it's like there's just this sort of gnawing that happens that you need to, there's some other way to express yourself. So I don't know if you can sort of form all that into a few thoughts for us, but
yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say is that for both of my careers, for medicine and for writing, to me it is all about human connection. And I'm a primary care doctor, so I'm like everybody's mother. So basically, I mean, but what I'm saying is that when people come in and they talk to me, that is to me, that is a sacred time, right? Somebody comes in and trusts you with whatever is on their mind, and you just sit there and listen. And it may not, I mean, we don't have very much time, but that is a connection that is so meaningful to me. So similarly, when I started writing, I whether or not the writing was good was never really kind of the question for me. The question was, how do I share it with people and then get better at it? So the in-person stuff was always very, very exciting for me. And then when you make friends that you trust, because they're you've seen their writing and you think it's wonderful and it's completely different from yours, then you can share in a way that is also meaningful, because they will appreciate what they think is good, and then they will give you suggestions for how to make it better. And that is also sacred to me, because it's in a way, when we write, we're bearing our souls, right, in a way that we wouldn't otherwise do. You probably wouldn't strike up a conversation about some of the things that we write about just with a random stranger on the street. Right. But yeah, so for me, it is all about connection. So the in-person stuff is very, very exciting to me.
Right. And so in going back to your personal journey, and you're talking about going over to India and connecting with your culture and those stories, and how important is it for you as a woman of color to be able to share those stories and work that magic into your writing in a personal way? And how important was it for you as a reader, as a young girl, to see people that were from your culture and that you could identify with? And I mean, I think we talk about that a lot these days and how important that is. And so maybe you want to talk a little bit about that too.
Yeah, I mean, when I was a kid growing up in the 70s and the 80s, I grew up in Kentucky. There were some Indian people in town, I mean, that we were really good friends with, but it wasn't like a huge community. And I will say that everything I read didn't have Indian people in it for the most part. And So I read lots and lots of books about people who weren't really like me, but that was fine as far as I was concerned, because I empathized with them. I related to those characters. I felt like they were me and I was them. So I think that the moral of that story is that anybody can read about anybody's story and feel like it is them. And that is part of the point of why we write, right? Is that we give insight into people's stories, and everyone can go along and have this adventure with this character and learn something from it.
Right.
Because it's part of the human condition, right? But I will say that, and then I went to India and read all those stories, and and they were kind of like fantastical stories for the most part. Some of them were historical, but fantastical, and not really my reality either, but still very interesting and cool. And of course, they came with pictures, which was, like half the battle. But I will say, it wasn't until, and then I read, The Jewel and the Crown and A Passage to India and all those kinds of older books that were wonderful, but they weren't set in the U.S. and they weren't set like in modern day. So they weren't exactly what my experience was either. It was not until I read Jhumpa Lahiri's work, Interpreter of Maladies, which was her first short story collection, and then The Namesake, that I was like, which is a novel, that I was like, okay, well, this is what it is actually like to be a South Asian immigrant here and have all these kinds of feelings and thoughts and doubts and, sense of wonder. And it was so beautiful. But that wasn't until I was an adult that I read that. So the answer is it's exciting to be able to share my perspective. And I wouldn't say that everything I think by definition, when you write, everything is from your perspective. So there's a little bit of you in everything that you write. And I think that one of my picture books that is going to be published in 2022, it's fiction, but it's a story about a girl and her grandmother about going back to India and coming back here. And it's called I'll Go and Come Back. And it was based on my relationship with my grandmother. And I have to tell you, I always thought of it as like a little story, like that was just about me kind of personally and kind of the feelings that I had. And once I got an agent and we sent it out to editors, I realized that it wasn't a little story, that people felt like it was a universal story, even if they weren't from India, even if they weren't immigrants, that this was about relationships and missing somebody and feeling out of place and how to make somebody feel better about that.
And I think that that's a lot of writing, right? I mean, and that's kind of what you're getting at as well, is that it's connecting with people in a personal way, which you don't necessarily do on just a regular going about your business daily type of thing. So maybe we'll circle around now. We're talking a little bit about your youth, and now you're writing for youth.
Yes.
So maybe how did the story for Midsummer Mayhem spark and grow and become an actual book, and sort of what was the timeline and how hard was that?
Okay, it's a long timeline. I will just let you know. So I think I took my first online class in 2012, and I don't even remember. It was just kind of like, one of the exercises we did was like, think of a bunch of ideas that you could potentially make into a story. So I just wrote down a random selection of things, and the thing that I kind of sparked this story was that when I was a kid, like my dad didn't travel very much, but when he did, sometimes he was gone for up to a week. And then he would come back, and I, with an overactive imagination, would think, what if the person who came back wasn't actually my dad, but somebody who looked exactly like him, and how would I know? Yes.
That's awesome.
I was
Great
like
idea.
that weird kind of kid. So I would have a series of little tests that I would have, like only my real dad would know this, and like he would answer this the right way. So that was the seed of this story, was what if there was a girl and her dad came back from a business trip and he was acting weird and she was the only one who noticed? And why was he acting weird, and why was she the only one who noticed, and what was she going to do about it? That was the beginning of this story.
Wow.
And then the other thing that kind of came into play was, I love the idea of imaginary friends, because they can seem very real to little kids. And then I was like, what if there was an imaginary friend who wasn't imaginary? What if he was real? And then who was he, and why was he there, and what was he doing? So, and then I was like, oh, and like, what if the imaginary friend like appeared in the woods? And then I was like, aha. So I'm a huge Shakespeare fan from like way back when. And A Midsummer Night's Dream takes place in the woods, and there are all kinds of people in that story that are maybe imaginary, but they're pretty real in the
Right.
story. And so it all kind of came together with this. That and add in my crazy love of baking.
Now, how do you work that into the story?
Exactly. So okay. So what I would say, so the main character Mimi loves to bake, and that's like one of her joys in life. And she's the youngest of four, and she's got three significantly older siblings who are all very accomplished at various things, and they're also kind of like always fighting. So at the beginning of the story, she's pretty much feeling invisible and like she's never going to amount to anything because she's got these really superstar siblings, and how is she ever going to prove herself? And then she visits a new bakery in town and finds out that they have a baking contest, and she's like, that's it, I'm gonna enter this baking contest, and if I win this baking contest I will finally prove to everyone that like I'm cool too. And that's how the story starts.
Okay, so that was like the perfect segue into another question I have,
Yes.
which is, you're a doctor,
Yes.
you're a writer.
Yes.
And I don't know if you already see this coming, but I totally see that as you have the, so according to society, what's, accomplished and what is expected of kids, whether it's college or occupations. And then you have the baker, the writer, the artist who wants to be able to do that passion on a professional basis, but usually they kind of have to prove themselves, win something or publish something or in some way be validated. They can't just go to art school or whatever. So you have a very unique perspective in actually living a very noble profession that is just traditionally noble, and then a very well thought of profession if it becomes a profession by publishing, but usually might be difficult getting there. So do you want to kind of give some insight on how people looked at both of those sides of you, the creative side and the scientific side, and how
Yeah.
that differed?
Oh, it's so interesting that you asked that question, because when you tell people you're a doctor, no one ever says, I always wanted to be a doctor. I have like some medical textbooks that are like in my back room, and every once in a while they pull them, and someday I'll get around to medical school and it'll all be fine. Nobody ever says that appropriately, because it's crazy, right? But when you tell people you're a writer, lots of people are like, oh, I've always wanted to write a book. I just don't have the time. I don't do this and I don't do that. And they play it down like anybody could do it. But what I would say, I think this is just part of this is just a product of our society, right? So what I would say is that everyone knows the kind of years of training sequence you have to go through as a physician in order to become a doctor. But people don't really know the years of training sequence you have to go through as a writer. And you do. It does require a lot of investment of time. Nobody was born writing a book. And I think that that's too bad, that society kind of undervalues the amount of time and effort and thought you have to put into writing. But I would also argue that writing is a noble profession, that it takes courage to come up with something from your imagination and make it something tangible, on a screen or on a piece of paper. So what I would say is that when people say, "Oh, I've always wanted to write a book," I just say, "Well, you should do it, because you can. You can, right? If you put enough time into it
Right.
and you try hard enough." But I would also say that like 99% of people, won't, right? So it's very interesting. So when writers feel like society is not appreciating them, I think that they should be proud that they're trying, and despite that. And the other thing that nobody ever really wants to talk about is kind of like how we measure success by money. Like, is it making you money or not? Look at like the most important profession in the history of professions, which is mother. Nobody ever pays you for that, but it is the most rewarding thing we can do.
Right.
So, I think also I would tell people just to put the money aside. Like, it's very easy to get wrapped up in all that. Like, why am I spending all this time? I'm not making any money.
Right.
You're doing something valuable, whether or not the money is there yet.
Right. And I mean, would you be able to make the connection of, as a doctor, you're saving lives in one way, and perhaps as an artist, you could be saving lives in a completely different way? I mean, do we discount that not quite as tangible and statistically proven way that you could possibly save a person?
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, as a doctor, we know that everyone's life comes to an end at some point, right? But the things that endure, that we pass on, are our children and books. Because, you know, like my favorite authors, you know, from my childhood, many of them are not with us anymore. But those books endure. And there are always new people reading them and getting something new from them. Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
And so how come middle grade? Out of all the genres, you said you do picture books as well, but
Yeah.
did you start out with a picture? I know a lot of times when we're talking to writers, they have several different projects, and did you just happen to pick this one up first? Do you have the picture book? You know, how does that whole smorgasbord work?
Right. So this is my my first novel. So I stuck with it through thick and thin. I first actually finished a first draft of this novel in 2014.
Okay.
And it was not great, but that's okay. And then I took some time and I revised it in 2015, and it was still not great. So I revised and revised and revised.
And did you revise on your own or with your critique group, or did you
With
have an agent at that point, or how did that work?
I didn't get my agent until the end of 2017. So I revised and revised with my critique group. I won a pitch contest at New England SCBWI, having not actually written the book that I was pitching. Like it was still a work in progress. And so I was like, oh great, now I get to submit it to this agent, and like, oh, I better write that, I better fix it so that it actually matches what I said.
Right.
Yeah.
And to just interrupt there, because we've never talked about pitches on here. Do you want to, I don't know if you remember your pitch or what you put into it or what a pitch is, if you want to kind of share a little more insight on what is a pitch, how do you write one?
Right. Okay, so a pitch is a short statement to try and get somebody to want to read your book. And the elevator pitch is kind of the quickest pitch, like you're literally in the elevator with somebody that you want to impress and they ask you what you're writing. You shouldn't just tell them randomly, they should ask you. So if they ask you what you're writing, you can give them a 1-line or 2-line pitch. And the elevator pitch for Midsummer's Mayhem is an Indian-American mashup of A Midsummer Night's Dream and Cupcake Wars. So that is like the, hey, do you want to read that now? Right. And then a kind of a longer version of a pitch is what you would put in your query letter. So when you're asking agents if they want to represent you, you put a couple of paragraphs in a query letter that you usually email along with a few pages of your manuscript. And so I will the general method that I used in my query letter was called the hook, the book, and the cook. So the hook is like, what is the thing that is going to want to make them, oh, I need to read this book, right? Which was the Midsummer Night's Dream meets Cupcake Wars. And then the book is like a very brief explanation of what is going on in the book. So in this case, it was this girl who wants to win a baking contest, but whose dad is acting funny, and he's a food writer, so he should know food, but he can't tell the difference between delicious and disgusting anymore. And she's like, I don't know what's going on. And then she follows music into the woods, meets a very interesting boy, and starts baking with him using ingredients they find in the woods. And then everyone around her starts acting even funnier. And so she's got to figure out what's going on and somehow win the contest. So that was the book. And then and the cook is yourself. And what I would say in terms of, putting this in a query letter is some people say, like me, I didn't have any writing experience. I had not published anything. Some people say, well, what's the point of like putting that in your letter? It just gives you a little insight into who you are as a writer and why you wrote this book.
Okay.
So I mentioned that my family is half Indian and half not Indian, and also that I live in Concord, Massachusetts, which is the setting for this book, only fictionalized.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's really cool.
Yeah.
And So you got your novel,
Yeah.
you worked on it, you critiqued it.
Yes.
And then while you're doing that, you're writing picture books,
Yes.
or you had those at the same time?
Yep, I
Okay.
would write them at the same time. I had two different critique groups, so a novel critique group and a picture book critique group, and we just keep going. And I got to tell you, the picture books that we've sold, like I wrote them, I can't even tell you how many drafts I wrote over and over and over and over again. That's okay, because generally they're like 500 words, so that's okay. Like you can do that. But you know, and then more classes and more critiques with professionals, sometimes with agents and sometimes with editors, but also my critique group. And then you are able to hone it to the point where, okay, I think this is actually something that might be interesting to someone. But I will also say that in the middle of all this, that just when you think something is done, you will get an agent, and the agent will be like, great, let's revise it like this. And you're like, okay. And then even after you sell your book, your editor is going to ask for revisions. Like nothing is ever perfect. All we can do is get it to as perfect as we can before we have to revise it for someone else. But it's a wonderful process. And it's actually comforting to know that it literally doesn't have to be perfection.
Right. And was that the original title?
Yes, I think it always was Midsummer's Mayhem. I have to say that, like, for a long time, I just always referred to it as Mimi because that's the main character in the book. And so, like, in my, in my laptop, like, there are all these, like, Mimi with, like, a date after it. And I don't know if you guys, if you talk about, like, writing programs, like, software that people use. So I used Scrivener to, so I think it's called Literature and Latte is the company that makes it. It's a great program because it, you can put an entire novel in there and you can put it in chapters, and there's like a little like a cork board where you can have like a little index card with like a a quick summary of the chapter, and then you can switch around the chapters just very easily. You just drag them, as opposed to a giant Word document where you're like, I don't know where I am anymore and how am I doing that. So that was very helpful for me in drafting novels.
Does that cost money?
Yeah, I think it's like, I mean, they sometimes have really good discounts, but it was like $40, like forever.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. So that was very helpful to me. When I revise, I sometimes take it out of Scrivener and I put it into Word. It can export it to Word or anything that you want.
Okay.
And then just seeing it in a different font, in a different format, means that I had new eyes on it. So yeah, so I mean, one of the tricks I've learned about revision is that you need to somehow have fresh eyes. So sometimes that is time. So at least a few weeks of not looking at it. And sometimes it is like physically different. Like if you print it out or you print it, you read it in a different font, it can just give you a new perspective on your writing. And then of course, another human who's never read it before, that definitely is a different perspective. So yeah, sometimes you're so close to your writing because you've looked at it for so long that you have no perspective, and just doing a couple of things to change it up can be very helpful.
Right. So I could talk for another hour with you. We never have enough time. But I usually like to try to close with if there's something sort of maybe you were hoping to mention or that you think might be an inspiration to writers, young, old, or otherwise. Pick whatever you'd like to tell them, and maybe something that was helpful to you to leave them with.
Yeah, so what I would say is I would just reiterate that writing is an act of courage, and I would encourage people to keep doing it, and that even though most of the things that I write are fiction, the things that resonate the most with me and with other readers tend to have a kernel of truth. So when you tell your truth, but you tell it through fictional characters, I think that's when the magic happens.
Ooh, love it. All right, well, thank you so much, Rajani, and I learned a lot about your book, but also just about the writing process, which is always interesting because everybody does so many different things, and it's nice to know there's no one way to do it. So if you'd like to view any of these interviews, and if you are an author and you'd like to be interviewed, go to www.theroomtowrite.org, and thank you, Rajani.
Thank you.